Howdy, folks, and welcome to Moose Podcast 295. Want to thank you folks for dropping by. You've been dropping by a lot lately, and I appreciate you so much, especially you slowly creeping up my numbers, not only in the United States, but across the pond, Sweden, Great Britain, you folks, Austria. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Hope my moose-isms translatable to other languages, and you can kind of understand what I'm mumbling about. Very grateful for you coming by. Thanks for the emails. Responding as fast as I can. You guys are great. Thanks so much. Can you believe it's already the 6th of June? Man, summer solstice is almost on us. That means spring's gone by. Jeez. Time's flying by. Want to thank my good friends at bedfords.com. Those folks, they've got, if you didn't know, this killer deal going on right now. Not only is the Z7 II at a lower price, it also comes with the amazing Delkin reader, which I just love that reader. I have a couple of them at the desk, in my briefcase, a backup in my luggage. I love that. It also comes with a 128 gigabyte Delkin card. So Bedford's, home of incredible inventory, great prices, super service, free shipping, and of course, my favorite, home of the Moose discount. Check them out. Phone call, in person, online, bedfords.com. Thank you guys for sponsoring the Moose Podcast. Well, let's get on with this week's episode. Yeah, it's time to call it quits. Yeah, it's something that actually comes to my mind quite often. I've actually talked about it before, why others call it quits when it comes to, being creative artists, be it musician, photographer, writer, actor, what have you. But no, that's not what I'm going to talk about this week. I'm talking about you and every other photographer out there. When you go shooting, do you know when it's time to call it quits? As in, it's a wrap? It's in the can? Aces? It's filed? Call it quits. The reason why I bring this up, saw a photographer last couple days. Man, I didn't know that many memory cards existed on the planet. Z9 ripping. Oh, he was ripping. And I gotta be honest with you, I didn't see a photograph. That was what was boggling my mind. And I just said to myself, does this guy know when it's time to call it quits? And then it dawned on me further that, perhaps he doesn't. I was trying to wonder if I had ever talked about or even thought about or mentioned to anybody, do you know when it's time to quit? Now, I have talked about, time to smell the roses. But I'm actually, how does one determine when you're out photographing anything or in photographing anything that it's a wrap, that it's done? If you're shooting a video, the ending is obvious, right? Because you either have reached the time barrier that you're going to be able to present your video, or whatever that moment is that you're capturing for that clip, that moment has just naturally come to an end. But with stills, there's not a on and then you let it run and then off. You go. And if you have a Z9, you go, yeah, because the shutter doesn't make any noise. So how do you know when time to call it quits? Thought about it, been pondering it. And I said to myself, how do I know when it's time to quit? Well, I kind of took a backwards look at it, and I said, well, how do I know when it's time to start? And there's a couple. The first one is the subject is present. there's many a times I go out shooting, and I've talked about this, how critters literally will skunk me, as in they're not there. I show up, but they don't show up. And so the shoot begins when the subject appears. And that's true for a lot of things, be it product shots or aircraft or models. They have to be there. So that's the natural start. But that's not the only start, especially for myself when it comes to landscapes, critters, aviation, because the subject is kind of like in photography. The one thing that has to be is it has to be sharp. So that's a given for the photograph to be, start its process of being, accepted and not deleted. It's first got to be sharp. So when to start is when the subject is present. So then a natural time to call it quits is when the subject goes away. It's gone. I said, okay, I can go with that as a first way of knowing it's time to call it quits. Subject is gone. Seems natural. Then I said, okay, how about something more challenging? How about knowing when it's time to start, time to call quit, when you arrive and the subject is already there, and then at some point you say, even though the subject's still there, it's time to call quits. How do you know that starting and ending point when you have the subject? Thought about it for a while, and one of the first, at least for myself, if the subject's present, I don't normally start clicking until a couple of things occur. One of them being that the subject is doing something or is about to do something, or in its very location makes it unique or rare, or if it's common, an uncommon something. So in other words, just because I'm there and the subject is there doesn't mean I'm going to take any photographs. There's a number of reasons for that. Probably the biggest one is the fact that in the back of my mind, I know that if I take the photograph, I instantly put the pressure on myself to then upload it in the computer and then look at it and then decide if it's worth finishing, if it's worth marketing. So if I don't take that photograph to start with, that's the best way I have for myself to edit. As in, if I don't take the picture, I don't have to make the decision later whether it's worth keeping and finishing. I've already made the decision because I don't have it. That's kind of when I know to start that camera firing. And conversely, I know when it's time to call it quit when that subject isn't doing anything to continue photographing. The one scenario came to my mind that made me laugh, and I was in my own head thinking about this, and people around me are wondering why I was laughing. But earlier this year on Lake Michigan, and there was a fire hydrant. It was just your basic fire hydrant. But the thing was, it was covered in ice, and in such a way, and it had this really funny sign on it. And right off the bat, I took a couple pictures, and then, okay, it was done. And how many pictures did I need of this frozen fire hydrant? It had lots of character, but how many photographs do I really need? Because it wasn't changing at all. It was what it was. And so it was natural. Time to quit. Couple shots, story done. So that led me to the next scenario, and probably the one that I bet will challenge most when it comes to starting or knowing when it's time to call it quits, because you're going to add everything we've talked about so far. Either you have the subject present when you show up, or you don't, you wait for it. You look for if it's being, uncommon or rare, or telling a story you want to, share with others. We're going to build on that. This is not exclusive. This actually is very important to the other parts. And that is that main ingredient, the thing that we write with to tell our story, light. I think light was probably, in my mind, as I was going through the checklist, the number one item that told me personally when to start taking the photographs and when to end. Got to preface this, being an old film guy, I've always, since day one, taken 5 of any one picture. So in other words, if I have a single fire hydrant in front of me and I want just one picture of it, I'm going to take 5. That's because back in the days of film, you made in-camera dupes this way. Talked about this a number of times. Not that you need to do it in digital by any stretch of the imagination, because once you take it and the frame is what you want, you can clone it or copy it, however you want to think about it, as many times you want. So you don't need to have in-camera dupes like you did with film. But I love that habit, and I carry it on for digital because I just love the sound of the camera. And even with the Z9, I don't shoot with it in silent. It makes a little noise. I still like to hear its sound go 3 to 5 times. It's just something that just brings me some pleasure. Now, with that said, so that thing with light, it's going to come and the light is going to work its magic when it comes to the subject. It's going to make it visually pop. It's going to give it texture or character or dimension or color, or it's going to have shadows with mystery, or, you know, the trilogy, the litany, the massive list that what light brings to our subject. And then if you expand it to the world in which is around it, that stage you have set in your viewfinder as you arrange elements, then the complexity of the light, or simplicity, however you want to define it and use it in your storytelling, that is, for myself, one of the big keys in deciding when to start shooting and when to stop shooting. One of the fun things we did when we were up photographing Kodiak brown bears a couple weeks ago is, at the end of the day, it was all in really good nature fun, and one of the ways we like to celebrate just how good a day it was, counting our blessings, looking at our good fortune. We would see how many frames or files or photographs everybody had taken. What was the number of images you had taken? And the vast majority of time, I was on the lower end of the spectrum. I was never at the top, mostly at the bottom, as in I took the fewest photographs. That does not an indicator of anything other than perhaps I have a better sense of, for myself, and this is key, this is really key, I have a sense for myself when to start and when it's time to call it quit. Now, the other part of that low number is just that ingrained habit I've had for decades that whenever I'm in Kodiak brown, grizzly bear, black bear habitat, and they're around, every 2 minutes I'm doing a full 360, making sure everything's clear. Nothing suddenly appears. I see it way off. We keep track of it. So nothing just pops up. That's how people get hurt. So that also kept me from getting some photographs like I mentioned in the last podcast. But that time to call it quit, that is something that comes with, believe it or not, practice. It starts with knowing what you want as a photographer, knowing what you have in your files that you need to complement, having knowledge of the subject, which is really important in all aspects, as well as knowing when it's time to quit, is simply the end point. And there is, in my opinion, and that's all it is, the last and final knowing when it's time to quit has to be knowing when it's time to smell the roses. I'm going to use the Kodiak Browns again for another example. When you're staring, in my case, for a long time through an 800 millimeter lens, you kind of get, I'm going to say, desensitized to the actual physical size of that bear, especially in its environment. As they come closer, they get larger in the viewfinder, and you can see that. But it's not till you take your eye away from the viewfinder and with both eyes, look at that bear and see the size of the bear in relation to its world. Do you really appreciate just what big brutes they really are? And just what a magnificent creature they are. And I think that's really where I want to kind of leave you here when it comes to time to call it quits. I think that if we were to just stop and count our blessings and look at what we have in front of us, not only will we be more grateful for all those moments that we're so blessed with, but I think it makes us better photographers. We get a much better sense of what we have in front of us that we're trying to put inside that viewfinder and then share through our photograph. By having that essence of, when it's time to call it quits and just appreciate the moment at hand. And that's really, I think, a big part of photography. You listen to my podcast, yeah, shutter speed and f-stop are part of it, but to move your photography forward, you have to get way beyond those basics that people always say that are so important, and they are. But man, you look at photographs that get published and those that win the Pulitzers and stuff, those are moments when the photographer related to that subject and made it click and knew that was time to call it quits. You guys are great. I truly appreciate you being out there. Here to help any way I can. And remember to make every click your story.